YouTube. So today we're going to review a Patrick Bet David podcast interview of Thomas Russo. And so for those of you who don't know these two individuals, the PBD podcast is a pretty large podcast on YouTube, 2.22 million subscribers, it looks like. And Patrick Bet David, I don't know a ton about him, nor do I pay all that much attention to him. And the reason being is because he's a very normie level conservative, neocon, just boomercon conservative that seems to be focused on, your very typical boomerish conservative, low taxes, strong military. I think he was in the military, limited government, things like that. And he's interviewing Thomas Russo, and Thomas Russo is the leader and founder of Patriot Front. And so the whole reason we're going to review this video is really not to, I'm going to reserve my judgment on Patriot Front and Thomas Russo, whether or not they're feds or anything like that. That's the first part, the first like 7 or 8 minutes of this video is really about whether or not he's a fed, or is this a federal movement or something like, or has the FBI, has this basically been led by the FBI, and does Thomas Russo work for the FBI? Kind of irrelevant, because their conversation really demonstrates the massive level of hypocrisy on the mainstream conservative right wing. So PBD really, from what I can tell, is in the same line as your Ben Shapiro's, your Charlie Kirk's, your Thomas Sowell's, your a lot of your, I don't know, think of any mainstream right wing conservative like a Ted Cruz or someone like that. I'm not saying PBD supports Ted Cruz, but I bet there would be a lot of overlap. Steven Crowder. And the whole point of that is to really demonstrate, number one, there is a lot of hypocrisy on the right wing, particularly as it relates to this particular topic around nationalism. And we're going to get into a number of areas around nationalism, why the right wing is so hypocritical about this, how they're really no different than the left and Democrats and liberals as it relates to this topic. And not only that, how the political landscape, for those of you who don't know, because maybe you watch a lot of the mainstream news, even Fox News. I'm not a boomercon conservative who watches Fox News. Fox News is a gatekeeping entity, in my opinion. And so anybody who watches the mainstream, to include PBD, I would argue you need to take what they say and do with a grain of salt. I would argue, CNN, Fox News, all these mainstream news outlets, to include Joe Rogan, they talk about Rogan a little bit in this. A lot of these people exist as gatekeepers for things that are allowed to be said, and maybe sometimes things that are on the fringes, but mostly what's allowed to be said, particularly for the right. A lot of these people are gatekeepers for the right wing. And so we're going to demonstrate today the massive level of hypocrisy as it relates to nationalism and civic nationalism, the differences, what they mean, and just how broad the political landscape is getting, and what direction the actual right wing in the West, in the United States as well as in Europe, what direction it's heading in. And so for those of you who don't know or maybe can't figure it out, nationalism is on the rise. Nationalism is becoming a more and more legitimate option and political ideology, cultural ideology. It's not just about politics, it's about community and things like that. But it's not just in the United States. I mean, just to demonstrate, here's a CNN article from September. And the title of this article, I'm not going to read this whole article, but Austria's Freedom Party secures first far-right national election since World War II. Nationalism is on the rise. Here's another article from CNN. I believe this one is from September 2nd, 2024. AfD becomes first far-right party to win German state election since 1945. So just to demonstrate that the political landscape is a lot bigger than what a lot of mainstream conservatives and quote unquote right wingers would actually be led to believe. Because, I know I just said you got to take what the mainstream says with a grain of salt. And I just pulled up mainstream CNN articles. But a lot of this stuff is focused on, as far as nationalism and the far right and things like that, in a very, very negative light. It's not shown as anything natural, and there's a lot of hypocrisy as it relates to the coverage of it. So that's why I say it's gatekeeping. That's why I say you have to take the mainstream with a grain of salt, because a lot of their coverage of this is very filtered. I would even argue this entire podcast is a great example of just gatekeeping hypocrisy by PBD. So again, we're going to demonstrate in multiple reasons, multiple areas, how hypocritical conservatives and mainstream right wingers are as it relates to this topic. So we're going to do a review of around 45 minutes of this interview. I'm not going to hit on everything. This is a fairly long video. This video is this video is an hour and 40 minutes long. But I think the meat of this 45-minute section here, because we're starting at around 7.5 minutes, and we'll go to around 56, 57 minutes. We're going to hit on a number of topics as it relates to nationalism, the right wing, mainstream right wing's perspective on it, and how it's no different than the left wing in a lot of ways. It's pretty much there's a lot of overlap. It's kind of weird, conservatives, how there's a lot of overlap as it relates to mainstream conservatism as well as mainstream liberalism. I would argue a lot of mainstream Republican politicians today are no different than they're just Democrats from 25 years ago. There really isn't a uniparty anymore. But this is just one of the areas to demonstrate the massive level of hypocrisy as it relates to conservatives and mainstream right wingers. So we'll go ahead and get started. And again, this is starting at 7.5 minutes in. The first 7.5 minutes was really establishing, or maybe putting, I wouldn't say it's character assassination, but really it's PBD throwing the idea out there that these guys may be feds. I'm going to reserve my judgment. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. I think the more important thing is conversations like this are starting to happen more and more. So let's focus on the actual topic, because I think it's interesting, and I think a lot of this, some of this was coming up on YouTube, years ago around Trump's first election, but then tons of people got kicked off of YouTube. So we'll see if this video stays up, but we'll go ahead and get started.
Listen, man. So how well? What are the benefits package of the feds? Like, how well do they pay you, man? Like, is there like
they don't pay me?
They don't pay you?
Nope.
Okay.
I'm not a federal agent.
Okay.
I am not being paid by anybody. And actually,
Why do you think so many people that are trusted don't believe you?
I think
because they're pushed mainstream gatekeepers for what is approved and what is not approved. It's a very simple question to answer, but Rousseau does a little more articulate job, but I'll just say a lot of people who are allowed on YouTube at this point and allowed in the media, they're gatekeepers. They're allowed to be there because they're not really saying or doing anything that is speaking truth to power. They're basically saying approved messages. It's why you have a Walgreens and a CVS on the same corner. Why would you have two of basically the exact same stores on the same corner? Because competition steers people to one area, and it's good for both of their businesses. So
it is partly astroturfed. I think because it is so convenient. Because when we do these big things, we are presented to millions of new people, because it is a spectacle when we go on march, when we have the drums and the banners and the uniforms and the masks. It is engineered to be something which is spectacular. It is very out of the ordinary, and people watch it. And it's very easy for a lot of conservatives, I believe, not the ones here, but a lot of conservatives to dismiss us by saying that's not real. It's fake. You don't have to engage with these people. You don't have to engage with their ideas. You don't have to engage with the fact that the political landscape might be bigger than you previously thought.
And so again, regardless if this guy's a Fed or not, or the Patriot Front it has been infiltrated by the Feds, maybe it has, maybe it hasn't, but what he's saying right there is actually fairly legitimate. The political landscape is much larger and is moving in a direction that a lot of people don't realize. Your average everyday boomer conservative really has no idea how the younger generations think and where a lot of people are starting to align themselves, and it's moving more and more towards nationalism. And we're going to get into that a little bit. We're going to get into why that is, and really we're going to focus on the hypocrisy of conservatism, though, because it's so hypocritical, their view on certain groups of people, but then someone like Thomas Russo, regardless if he's a Fed or not, I mean, he's just demonized. He'd be demonized by every other boomer conservative out there. Is just a horrible person who is akin to Hitler, and he's racist and he's evil and immoral. But we're going to get into all that.
So it's an argument of convenience that they are also, a lot of people are worried about guilt by association because the left throws around words like white nationalist and neo-fascist, and I haven't.
The right wing throws around those words too. White nationalists, Nazis. I mean, just look at Ben Shapiro as it relates to, nationalists who are for European races, or nationalists who are for the Caucasian, people of European descent in the United States. He says very similar stuff. It's bad,
I called myself those things. But the left throws around these labels wantonly. And a lot of people decide, okay, well, I'm going to stay away from anybody the left labels with those things. But the thing is, these aren't real definitions. These are insults.
They're absolutely not real definitions. I'll give you one example, because I've said this in multiple videos that I've done, and I've also done a video on the word nation and nationalism, because most people use that word today, particularly in the United States. They use it incorrectly and they don't understand the full context of the word. So most people, when they refer to nation or nationalism or something like that, most people associate nation as it just means country or state. They have no idea, even though that in a lot of other ways they use it correctly, but they still don't associate it always in its appropriate historical context. So, for example, there are, Indian for North American, indigenous populations. We use a broad spectrum racial term like Indian. However, Indian is a broad spectrum racial term. There are many different distinct people groups under that umbrella. The Cherokee Nation is not the same as the Iroquois Nation, or the Sioux Nation, or the Seminole Nation, or the Mohawk Nation. Those are distinct people groups with their own languages, their own cultures. Maybe they have their own mythologies, and some live in the woods on the East Coast. Some lived on the plains. And so they're all Indians, but they are distinct people groups. It's the same thing as it relates to white people. White people is a broad spectrum racial term for many different nations. The Scottish are not the English. They're both white, but they're distinct people groups. The English are not the Germans. They're both white, but they're distinct people. The Germans are not the French are not the Irish are not the Swedes. Those are all distinct nations. That's why white nationalism is a nonsensical pejorative today. It doesn't mean anything because white is a broad spectrum racial term. White is not a nation. So you can't have white nationalism. You can have American nationalism. You can have German nationalism. You can have Cherokee nationalism. You can have Jewish nationalism. White nationalism means nothing. So it's just a mainstream pejorative. He's correct.
They're labels to censor and silence people. When they call you racist, when they call you a Nazi, when they call you all these things. And it's a lot easier for some people to say, hey, I'm not a racist. Those guys aren't even real. As opposed to saying, hey, these are patriots. These are nationalists. They may not be like me. They may not agree with me on everything.
Yeah, but that's different, though. You're saying the left. Musk had a meeting with Trump the other day.
Well, Musk
You know,
wasn't using those terms exactly.
No, I know, but Musk doesn't trust you and your camp based on what he's saying. Like, hey, let's investigate these guys. Joe Rogan is a very reasonable guy.
I agree.
Guy that's and some may.
Joe Rogan's a reasonable guy. Joe Rogan has had a lot of opinions that he's had to backtrack on for various reasons. I would argue because he's been allowed to be the largest podcast in the world. You know, he had to backtrack on. He used to be a moon landing denier. He doesn't deny that anymore. He's starting to make some jokes about it and whatnot, but he really doesn't say that anymore. He used to criticize, you know, the efficacy maybe of a response to COVID around the vaccines. Kind of had to backtrack on that. You know, that there are certain things that Joe Rogan will not talk about. There are certain things that PBD won't talk about. There are certain groups of people that these podcasts won't refer to. Same thing with Alex Jones. I'm not saying Alex Jones and Joe Rogan and PBD don't say some truthful things, but there are things that they are not allowed to talk about. And I think that's one of the signs of the fact that, yeah, they are a part of the system that pushes certain narratives, particularly for the right.
May even from the left are sitting there saying, why would Alex Jones criticize you and say you were tied to Obama, you know, and one of your founders was, you know, doing stuff with Obama campaign.
I know what he's talking about.
Tell me.
So Alex Jones is familiar with Charlottesville, and I believe what he's talking about is one of the organizers of Charlottesville, Jason Kessler, did publicly work for the Obama campaign at some point years before, but I have never worked for the Obama campaign. You can search for a million years. You'll never find a single statement of me ever supporting Obama. And Alex Jones said he'll release a report on that matter in a week or two. I don't think it ever...
I think if he sees this, he will react to this and say... So Jason Kessler, I just pulled it up, is an American neo-Nazi white supremacist, anti-Semitic...
I've never worked with him directly.
You've never worked with him directly?
No.
So you guys have never spoken, never done anything together, no communication?
We spoke at various times at Charlottesville. Off and on.
So what do you and him agree on, you and Jason Kessler?
I do not know the man personally. I don't have a list.
I'll also say that a lot of these questions are pretty low tier. PBD's almost asking him a lot of gotcha questions. Let me associate you with someone who is clearly a hypocrite or is clearly a horrible person or can put you in this box of evil, or someone that we've deemed is someone that we can demonize. I mean, a lot of these questions are really, I mean, Thomas Rousseau says, you know, he's I think he says somewhere in this video, you know, these are, you know, this seems like a leading question. I would agree with him. A lot of these questions are very, it's almost like PBD's trying to quote unquote gotcha. And I mean, if you scroll down here in the comment section is going to agree with me. So anybody that comes across this video, you know, any PBD fans or anybody like that, I mean, I'm just scrolling down. I haven't filtered this or done anything, but I mean, the first comment I see is LMAO PBD tries for gotcha questions, which I just said, and then at the end tries to blame quote unquote childhood trauma based on nothing. That's a pretty critical comment. But if he was proud to be any other race, no one would bat an effing eye. Yeah, we're going to get into that. Patrick accused him at the end of being triggered. It was actually Patrick that was triggered. 1965, don't act ignorant. I now understand Patriot Front and admire them. We're actually going to get into 1965 and the significance of an immigration act that Thomas is going to discuss. PBD literally couldn't understand the Immigration Act of 1965, changing the entire landscape of the nation, and keeps going on to the Constitution. I mean, a lot. If you read through these comments, PBD's getting criticized pretty heavily, and we're going to get into why. So, continuing.
He has changed his beliefs several times throughout his political career, to the best of my knowledge.
When's the last time you spoke to him? Like, is there an allegiance there where you guys get on?
No, there is not.
When's the last time you guys had communication?
Years.
Okay, got it. So let's set that one aside. So let's go to...
But that's where I think the Obama fact is coming from.
Okay, so again, this is the great thing about asking questions. You know, the audience can go do their own due diligence, and people can react to it. Let me continue. So your position, I'm reading some of the stuff that you've said. An African may have lived, worked, and even been classed as a citizen in America for centuries, yet he is not American, okay?
Yes.
He is, as he likely prefers to be labeled, an African in America. The same rule applies to others who are not of the founding stock of our people or do not share the common unconscious that premates throughout our greater civilization and the European diaspora. The American identity was something uniquely forged in the struggle that our ancestors waged to survive in the new continent, not simply by birth, by one granted this title, but by the degree to which he works and fulfills the potential of his birth. So what do you think, like, if you were to break down what you believe in, do you want America to be a place where it's all white nationalists and nobody else that's not a white nationalist will be here? Would that be an ideal situation for you?
Not necessarily, and I believe that might be a bit of a leading question. But when you're talking about that statement in particular,
Yeah.
and it is from an older version of the manifesto, it has been updated and clarified. But when you look at different groups in America, blacks have been very much culturally, economically, socially, and even legally distinct from what we call white Americans, or I simply refer to as Americans.
Nothing he's saying here is even remotely controversial. Literally nothing he's saying here is even remotely controversial. You can break things down by crime rate statistics, which are now being skewed. Hispanics are being included as white in crime rate statistics, but you can break things down by crime rate statistics. You can break things down by colleges, historically black colleges and universities versus, Harvard or something like that. You can break things down by, you want to quote unquote trust the science. You can break things down by IQ, levels of IQ. There's 100 years of IQ statistics around different racial groups. I mean, there's all different kinds of statistics to demonstrate different groups of people create different societies and cultures. Different groups of people are different. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong. That's not saying one group of people is better than another group of people, but to say and act like everyone is the same and everybody's equal all the time is utterly ridiculous. Even, I know conservatives are going to go crazy about this, but they're going to, I can hear a conservative right now. We're talking about the law, equality under the law. There's no such thing as equality under the law right now. And I will give you just a few examples. Number one, if a man commits a crime and a woman commits the same crime, do they get treated exactly the same way, even if they're the same age? No, they don't. I mean, just one example would be you have female jails and you have male jails. Female incarceration, male incarceration, which, by the way, 90+% of the people who are incarcerated right now are men. So you got a massive problem. Men and women are different, and they're not treated exactly the same in the legal system. You have divorce statistics, and what laws favor men in a divorce? A lot of laws favor women in many different states. We delineate under the legal system based on age. That's an immutable characteristic. You can't help what your age is. You can't help when you were born. A 40-year-old man commits a crime. A 13-year-old minor commits a crime. Are they going to get treated the same? No, not necessarily. So we delineate between age. We delineate between IQ. IQ is an immutable characteristic. If two 40-year-old men of the same race and same age commit the exact same crime, but one has an IQ of 120 and another has an IQ of 60, are they going to get treated the same? No. One's going to be considered mentally impaired, whatever the legal term is it. Another one will be considered of normal cognitive ability. There are all types of immutable characteristics that we delineate on. So it's very, very hard to make the argument on quote unquote legal equality. It's a very interesting argument.
For the entire history of this country, and from the 1600s to the 2020s, there are groups in this country that are very distinct. And when I say American, I'm not referring to purely as a citizen, but I'm referring to a member of the American nation, which I believe is a cultural, as an ethnic group, just like Iranian, just like a member of any country from Europe. But I believe we should treat the native, true-born population of America in the same way that other countries are purely allowed to recognize that somebody from this country has a unique cultural background.
Oh, you mean like the Japanese do in Japan, the Chinese do in China? There are tons of ethnostates around the world that nobody bats an eye at. I mean, we'll actually get into an ethnostate that a lot of conservatives support. I mean, literally, I'm going to demonstrate it, if you support Israel, you support an ethnostate. I will show you with legal documents. They're going to get into Israel a little later, but Israel is absolutely an ethnostate for the Jewish nation.
And this isn't to say that blacks are not here, that they do not have a unique culture on this continent. It is simply to say that they are so distinct, both racially, economically, socially. Segregation still exists de facto today. Many communities are largely one or another population.
Correct. Many communities are largely one or the other. It even exists in churches. Look at churches. They're a lot of times very culturally segregated, naturally.
I believe these differences are so distinct that we ought to consider them as different nations, perhaps within the same government.
Okay, so what does that really mean? Going back to my question.
Sure.
I'm from Iran.
Okay.
Okay. My mother's Armenian. My dad's Assyrian. I came here.
How would you be able to identify the differences between Armenian and Assyrian if they're not different groups of people? Why is it okay to delineate between Armenian and Assyrian? That does not mean that one is better than the other. Mm-hmm. That does not mean... I don't understand. Sorry. That does not mean that there is a hierarchy to racial groups. It does mean there are distinct differences.
In November 20, 1990. June 20th of 1999, I become a U.S. citizen. I joined the Army with a green card, okay? What do you consider me? Do you see me as an American or do you see me as an Iranian?
I would think you are a citizen. You are legally and civically a part of the United States. And I would classify you as a good citizen. You are a businessman. You have brought a lot of value to the country. However, I would say that you are distinct from an American. And I am not somebody who believes that everybody who is not American is by default worse than. Mm-hmm. I don't put the world into that kind of hierarchy. But I believe there is a distinction there. And when you're talking about, what I would want to do, I think immigration should be restricted. I think all of the illegals should be sent home. I think anybody who lied about their naturalization status in order to get it unlawfully should be sent home. Like Tucker Carlson, you spoke with him recently. Mm-hmm. He mentioned how everybody with a dual passport should have to choose. Mm-hmm. Things like that are a great start, and I think you would really be able to help demographically secure the country. But, are we asking, should the United States have anybody within its borders in any civic capacity, which is not a national, which is not a true cultural, assimilated person? I think there is some room for that, and I think there's some room for that in a lot of reasonable governments. But what we're talking about today, or what we're talking about in the country today, mm-hmm. is the fact that should these globalist policies be allowed to completely transform the cultural and demographic landscape of the country? And I believe that would make it something entirely different.
Just to demonstrate how much the demographic change and how dramatic it has been in one lifetime. In one lifetime, the demographic change in the United States has been something that is historically, there's never been anything like it ever in history. I mean, you have had such a demographic change in the United States that you've had hundreds of millions of people who have, that are not of the founding stock in the United States. Now, I'm not saying all of those people weren't here prior to what I'm about to show, but in the lifetime of the boomers, post 1960s, you have had a massive demographic change in the United States in the orders of tens of millions of people that have migrated to the US. And most of those people who have come here have not come from, they come from very different cultures, very different backgrounds. And a lot of them are here, whether this is nice or not nice, a lot of them are here for financial reasons. They're not here to assimilate. They're not here to learn the culture and learn about the founding fathers and read the Constitution and things like that. I'm not saying people haven't done that. What I am saying is the majority of them, the overwhelming majority of people who come to the United States, who come from certain countries, come here, and cultures come here for purely financial economic reasons. So just to demonstrate, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. So this is the smoking gun that a lot of people, or that you can point to, that really started a massive demographic shift in the United States. And so this was the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, also known as the Hart-Celler Act, was a federal law that changed the United States immigration policy and dramatically altered its racial and ethnic makeup. Yes. We're going to show it right now. I mean, this is just, none of this is conspiracy theory. This is all out there. So let's see. We've got, here we go. So this is the Brookings Institute. You know, this is not some brookingsinstitute.edu. And I mean, this is something that I just recently pulled up. This is from July 2020. The nation is diversifying even faster than predicted, according to new census data. So if you scroll down here, this is all the racial demographics of the United States. In the year 2000, 69.1% of the country was white. In 2019, 60.1% of the country was white. So you had a 9% decrease in almost 20 years. Under age 16, in the year 2000, 61, call it, percent of people under the age of 16 were white. In 2019, 50% of people are considered white. You know, why does this matter? 69% in 2000 to 2019, you have around 60% of the US population is white. Well, just to show you how dramatic this demographic shift has been from 2019, this is a few years old, so this 60% is probably lower now. This is about 5 years old. Demographics of the United States in 1950. You can also Google the 1960s because the percentages are not that different. Demographics of the United States in the 1950s. No major variation occurred in the racial composition thereof the national population between 1940s and 1950s. Was a slight decrease from 89.9% to 89.5% of the proportion of white persons in the total population. 90% of the population in the 1950s and 1960s was white. People of white European ancestry. Fast forward to today, less than 50% of the people under age 16 are white. And whether you like it or not, the founding stock of the United States, the people who created Western civilization, are those of European descent. Western civilization did not come out of Asia. It did not come out of Africa. It did not come out of, Central America and South America and the native indigenous populations there. It came out of the European nations. Demographic groups are not fungible. You can't just replace entire populations of people and expect the same results. It's not possible. This has been a massive demographic shift in the order of tens of millions, if not 100+ million people. It's a huge amount of migration to a country. It's massive. I'm not sure there's anything like it in history.
My sons, their mother is white. Their mother's white. She was born in Texas, Houston, Texas. Their dad is Middle Eastern. What are my kids? Are they American?
I would say they are half and half.
So if they're not born here to you, they're not American. If they're not, so what do I
No. Just like if they were not born in China, they would not be considered Chinese. You know, if they were born in Japan, they would not be considered Japanese. The land is not necessarily what makes you a part of a nation or a distinct people group. This is not magic dirt. You know, the American people had a demographic. They were mostly white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. That is the majority of the people who created the first, who established the United States of America. That's not disputed.
Have to be fully American in your eyes?
You personally?
Anybody.
So an American, I believe, is a member of the European race, any of the nations of the European race. And they not only, you aren't American simply by being a member of the European race. You have to have lived in America and assimilated to the American culture, the American heritage, which is harder to do nowadays because our culture has been so diluted. Things have been made much less sincere, I believe, when we look back at our history. So somebody not only a member of the European people, but also specifically a member of the who has assimilated to the American nation, just like anybody might assimilate.
Got it. So have you done ancestry on your family?
Yes.
And what showed up? What came up for you?
I have ancestors from both my mother's and my father's side that go back to the 1700s before the Revolution.
And where do they come from?
Scotland, Britain, and I have some French and German ancestry as well.
Was it 100% Scotland, Britain, and was there anything from the Middle East at all?
No, not that I know of.
Why does there need to be? I mean, what kind of question is that? I mean, what kind of question is that? Who cares? I mean, of course, the European people aren't distinct people. It's people from the Middle East. It's people from Asia, people from Africa. Those are distinct people groups. Those are the only people groups that can have distinctions and can govern themselves, and nobody bats an eye. I mean, we're going to get into the level of hypocrisy as it relates to stuff like this. But I'm really just trying to establish that focus on the topics at hand and how PBD is reacting to a lot of this stuff.
0% from anything else.
Entirely European. Yeah.
So for you, ideally, let me go back to it, because on another article, when you're talking about the Patriot Front's propaganda tactics and dissemination methods. Let me just read this to you. This is an article written about you. You can react to it. So Patriot Front prioritizes the dissemination of propaganda as a core feature of its organizational activity. Here are some of the key tactics and methods they use. Physical propaganda dissemination. Members are required to participate in physical propaganda dissemination and attend public events as a condition of membership. This could involve distributing flyers, posters, and stickers in public places. Okay, cool. Online presence. The group maintains a careful public image with propaganda and public activity intentionally void of overt racism and hateful conduct. This sanitized public image allows for a wider reach to others who may be sympathetic to the worldview. Okay. 3, professionalism and publicity. The organization places significant emphasis on professionalism, publicity, and membership growth. Okay, next one, recruitment. Patriot Front quietly recruits new members who are worried about a nation overrun by immigrants and a world controlled by loose. Their propaganda acts as a funnel to more extreme organizations and ideologies through their online presence and organizational affiliation. You can obviously dispute that, but it says recruits quietly. So I'll come back to this. Intimidation and vandalism. The group engages in a mix of vandalism, intimidation, and to foster anxiety. They use attention-grabbing techniques like igniting smoke bombs during demonstrations and protests. Secrecy. Patriot Front communicates secretly and avoids talking about guns or violence online. This is done in an effort to avoid attracting negative publicity and government intervention. Which of these do you think is inaccurate about your organization?
So they say that we use colored smoke at demonstrations or banner drops to instill anxiety or fear. That's a ridiculous point. You'll find photographers using colored smoke for attention-grabbing photos. It's the same reason we do it. They're entirely harmless. And Private communications are so that we can hide things from the world. No, your company here, I don't imagine every communication between all of your employees is public. You can't look that up on Twitter. When you're talking about recruiting members quietly, I don't know how we
How
would.
do you recruit them? Where do you recruit the guys from? Where do you find them?
We have a website, and
Okay.
people find the organization on any of our publications, or they see us in person, or a lot of
Yeah, they're going to go through the website. I don't really care about the website. Let's skip a few
very
minutes.
traditional American view of patriotism. And
Okay.
again, there's many different examples.
What skills do you have to benefit the organization? Activism. So you value activism, planning.
And the recruits, we think you're American. We think you're one of us ethnically and culturally, so you're good to go. No, we select for men of character, men of good conduct, men who are disciplined enough to be in an organization with rules and with security and with practices upon which there are stakes. And after that,
Yeah, let me read some of the founding documents some of the documents from the early United States of America. So I'm going to get rid of some of this stuff. So there we go. So here's one. The Naturalization Act of 1790 was the first law to establish uniform rules for granting citizenship to non-citizens in the United States. So this 1790 Act set the new nation's naturalization procedures. It limited access to the U.S. citizenship to white immigrants, in effect, to people from Western Europe, not just any Europeans, from Western Europe, who had resided in the U.S. at least 2 years, and their children under the 21 years of age. So you also had to be of good, upstanding moral character. So it wasn't just, criminals and horse thieves and these people like that who could come to the United States. That was one of the first naturalization acts. Here's the Declaration of Independence, which I'm sure most conservatives have probably never even actually read the Declaration of Independence. I've met a ton of conservatives. I'm not saying none of you have, but a lot of conservatives never even read some of this stuff. So I'm just scrolling down. This is the Declaration of Independence. And I quote, YouTube may flag this video, but I'm just reading one of our founding documents. And I quote, "He has excited domestic insurrection amongst us, and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions." Yeah, the native indigenous populations were not considered the same as other citizens within the United States of America. So PBD gets into, we need to read history, Thomas Rousseau, and starts getting into the whole, has Hitler influenced you? Here's another thing for a lot of boomer cons and conservatives and everything like that. The whole, well, Hitler liked it, and Hitler was a nationalist, and Hitler this and Hitler that, and you're a Nazi and all this kind of stuff. A, that's something that the left wing does. B, Hitler needs to stop being this moral barometer for everything that is relevant to politics and war and history. Hitler was a political figure who lived almost 100 years ago at this point, who, if you read about him and study him, he's just a historical figure. If you read Mein Kampf, how is that any different than reading the biography or autobiography of Joseph Stalin or Genghis Khan or plenty of other immoral, bad leaders throughout history? And again, he needs to stop being this moral barometer for everything. Just because Hitler likes something and you like it doesn't therefore mean that you are Hitler. Hitler loved to paint. He was a painter. Does that mean all painters are Hitler? No. Likewise, Hitler was a nationalist. Kind of. He himself, I believe, was he Austrian? But he was a German nationalist. Kind of weird. But he was a nationalist. Just because Hitler preferred nationalism doesn't mean that if you were a nationalist, you were therefore Hitler, and you want to start a world war and all of that. A lot of our founding documents have a nationalist tone. Our founding fathers would completely and utterly not recognize our immigration policies today, the demographics of the United States, the culture. They would have no clue where they were. Forget technology and all that. Just culturally and demographically, this is not what they intended. You could easily argue that.
There could be several in-person meetings, which are variable depending on what we've learned in the process so far and where you might be going and what local representatives you might be speaking to.
How did you learn how to do this? Who taught you these tactics?
Well, I got started in political organizing, on the sort of it could be called the right-wing fringe. I don't like reducing things into purely left and right, but the nationalist politics. I started organizing at 17, 18, and Patriot Front is a result of 7 straight years of adaptation and evolution and A/B testing. Because, like you've gone through many different jobs and business ventures in your life,
Yep.
Patriot Front has gone through many iterations, many updates to its structures. Because what Patriot Front is doing in its particular realm of politics, when I showed up, I was fresh out of high school, there was not a handbook written out. There weren't all the rules. Nobody was there to say, hey, don't do this because this is going to happen to you. And we have had to find out a lot of things the hard way, but we do really well in trying to find out mistakes before we make them. Because, you're familiar with the violent tactics of anarchists and Antifa, and you're familiar with people online who will try to find somebody's identity and use it to destroy their lives. There's a few videos that have gone viral of, somebody who the left and the internet thinks has done some racist thing, and they get millions of views, their life gets turned upside down, they get kicked out of college, all those things. So there's a lot of security matters that come into place there, and we've had to build that up over time.
Have you ever had conversations or communication with the FBI?
No.
Have you ever met with the FBI?
No.
Why'd you think about it?
Well, I was wondering if at any points in our marches in Washington, D.C., we'll often have a lot of cops come up and talk to us.
Yeah.
Usually those are regular D.C. Metropolitan Police. Sometimes I believe there's a few lieutenants in there. Could there have been one of them who's an FBI agent who walks up and says, hey, why don't you... I do remember a few times. I don't know if he was FBI, though. But there was a gentleman who walked up to the front of the marching column and said, hey, you're obviously the one in charge. I'm not wearing a mask. I got the big hat on. He said, hey, next time you're showing up to Washington, give me a call. He hands me a business card. I'm not interested in talking to the FBI. I ripped it up.
How many members do you guys currently have? Is it 160?
No, it is considerably above that. But
So PBD asks these questions about how large they are, how large Patriot Front is, which is just astonishing to me because, he references 160 people. Why would PBD be interested in someone who is the leader of a group that has no political power and has a group of 160 people? Why would PBD be interested in that? Because PBD doesn't talk to other nationalist groups. There are tons of other groups in the United States that are nationalist in nature. The Congressional Black Caucus. The Congressional Black Caucus is inherently nationalist. These people hold political office. These people hold power and influence public policy. National Black Caucus. They're not out for my interests. I, as a white male, they're not out for me. I mean, let's look at the CBC leadership. Let's look at their leadership. Oh, what do you know? They're not very diverse. This is literally a political entity, a nationalist political entity, who probably has more donors and more people than 160. But yet, PBD's not interviewing them. And that's a national... Patriot Front and Thomas Rousseau have no political power. I mean, we don't know all their members, but he doesn't hold any political power. He has no actual power in the United States. I mean, in a part of this video, PBD references Candace Owens. Here you go, conservatives. Candace Owens, who is the leader of Blexit. What is Blexit? The black exit of the Demographic Party. Here's their website. I don't see a lot of diversity in this picture here. I mean, this is a movement that is backed by Turning Point USA, Charlie Kirk. I mean, these boomer con conservatives who support this is an identitarian nationalist political movement without question. I mean, here's their website. Blexit is the largest conservative minority grassroots movement in the country. It is a movement to drive traditional American principles into urban communities across the United States of America, to promote economic independence, individual freedom, strengthen the nuclear family, and foster a deeper appreciation for patriotism, in Black American culture. We focus on shifting the culture as well as educating and uplifting minority America through educational programs and acts of community service. Yeah, this is a nationalist movement for Black people. And PBD references Candace Owens. Why isn't he interrogating Candace Owens the way that he's interrogating Thomas Rousseau? Candace Owens, she was a part of the Daily Wire. Which the Daily Wire, all of you BoomerCon conservatives, here's AIPAC. Who is AIPAC? Here's our website. We support pro-Israel policies that strengthen and expand the U.S.-Israel relationship in ways that enhance the security of the United States and Israel. AIPAC is America's pro-Israel lobby, closely monitors a broad range of issues that affect the U.S.-Israel relationship. Over the past 60 years, AIPAC has built a reputation for providing reliable, credible, and timely research and information for decision makers in Washington and across the country. Yeah, AIPAC is a political lobby for Israel in the United States. Israel. Let's look up Israel. Israel, which just recently passed something called the Basic Law. Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. This is literally Wikipedia. I can pull up other sources for this. Basic Law. Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people. Informally known as the Nation State Bill or the Nationality Bill, is an Israeli basic law that specifies the country's significance to the Jewish people. It was passed with 62 in favor, 55 against, and 2 abstentions on July 19, 2018, and is largely symbolic and declarative in nature. The law outlines a number of roles and responsibilities by which Israel is bound in order to fulfill the purpose of serving as the Jewish nation state. Israel is an ethnostate. If you support Israel, you support an ethnostate. You have no business whatsoever criticizing someone like Thomas Rousseau. Whatsoever. PBD, the only reason PBD is interviewing this character right here is because he's a nationalist for white Americans. That's the only reason. He doesn't care. Here's the Asian Student Alliance. Well, who is this for? Eligibility in the Asian Student Alliance. Current 9th grade to 22-year-old AAPIs, NGA. You do not need to be in school or have pursued a higher education. We define AAPI as individuals whose ethnic heritage originates from locations in South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, Polynesia, Micronesia, on and on and on. This is an ethnic organization. This is a nationalistic ethnic organization, not for people like me. Here's the NAACP. Here's literally the front page of the NAACP. Scroll down a little bit. Putting Black America first. So this group doesn't care about certain groups of people, clearly. But PBD doesn't care about all that. I mean, you can go through his entire channel. He's not interrogating a lot of these other groups and people like he's doing Thomas Rousseau. The only reason he's interviewing someone that he thinks may only be leading a group of 160 people is A, you can make an argument maybe he's a Fed, which still, why is that interesting? But B is because he pushes an ideology that is completely and utterly not allowed. I will be surprised if this video is probably not heavily scrutinized, maybe even taken off of YouTube, whatnot. But the only reason PBD is interviewing Thomas Russo is because he's pro-white. He's pro-white. So this video is already an hour long. You can go through the rest of this video. I would say the next 20 minutes are probably the most interesting, where they get into political groups. They get into Israel a little bit. They get into what influenced Thomas Russo. PBD thinks that somebody got to him and it was Hitler who influenced him and just made him angry and have rage and things like that. And what PBD can't understand, what a lot of conservatives, especially boomers, who grew up in the United States prior to, people who didn't immigrate here, who were born here prior to the 1965 and all that. Boomers don't realize their version of America is not the version of America that I grew up in. It's not the version of America that Thomas Russo grew up in. I mean, he goes into a story where he went back to his school because he was watching a World War II veteran from the United States, a white World War II veteran, just talk about to a room full of middle schoolers about his experience. And the room full of middle schoolers was a bunch of Indian kids from the subcontinent of India who did not really care. They're very apathetic to the World War II veterans' stories. Why? It's not their history. The founding fathers are not their founding fathers. That's why a lot of people don't understand, a lot of conservatives don't understand. Ilhan Omar does not care about the Constitution and the founding fathers. She probably looks at the founding fathers, my founding fathers, as evil human beings. Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. That's what legal immigration gets you, conservatives. But anytime someone like Thomas Russo or, Greg Johnson or Nick Fuentes or Vox Day or any of these people, they get kicked off YouTube. They get demonized just like the left demonizes people like Ben Shapiro. It's so hypocritical. Mainstream conservatives are so hypocritical about this issue. And it's so obvious. I mean, the racial stuff in the United States is so obvious at this point that it's kind of not even interesting to talk about some of this stuff. And I'm not even saying I support Nick Fuentes or I support Thomas Russo or anything like that. But to not even recognize the hypocrisy is just utterly ridiculous. So I'll link this video, this video in its entirety in the description below. But I thought this would be kind of an interesting topic to discuss. Hopefully this video doesn't get kicked off YouTube. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you on the next one. Thanks.